Hi,
Here we are.
Nicolas.
Hi, Anno.
I'm so sorry about what happened or not happened. We should have thought about this, but unfortunately, you know, fortunately next week it will be different, right?
Yes, next week we're back to normal.
Okay, good.
It's really strange because I actually, when I was flying back from Germany on Saturday, I realized that there was going to be a time change, and I was thinking that it's a good thing that I, wasn't affected by it with the flight, and I never thought that it would affect the class. I just didn't think of that.
So we still have like together half an hour. Is that correct?
That's correct, and I'm going to suggest, because I don't want to interrupt Professor Mittler's talk, so I was just going to simply switch off here. I can, from my office, I was going to connect via video streaming.
Yes.
Because at least I can watch it part of the time.
Great.
My only question is if there was a way for me, because later on I could actually rejoin, so to speak, if I should telephone a question in.
That would be excellent. I think that would be really very nice. I don't know how that would work technically, but I think just by calling us. But
I would maybe just call you on your cell phone, Anno. Would that work?
Yes, that would work. Great. So
okay.
This is the 21st century. So I think we can start officially now. And first of all, I would like to welcome Barbara Mittler from the University of Heidelberg, who will I introduce in a second. I have to kind of make a comment about what we were talking about. We did not think about the time change in Germany, which will be happening also next week in the US. So we will be back on the 6-hour difference, but now it's like 5 hours, I think. So it didn't work. So they have to leave in half an hour. And this is especially unfortunate, but we just heard that Nicolas is going to come back because Barbara Mittler, as she told me when I picked her up from the train, that she kind of reacted also to the last lecture, and she also wanted to discuss a couple of things with you, Nicolas, or you might want to discuss something with her. But we also have the opportunity to use the Facebook platform, which has not been used so much so far, but maybe this is a good idea and a good start. Again, welcome Barbara Mittler from the University of Heidelberg. I would like to introduce you first. She is holding the Modern China Chair at the University of Heidelberg at the Institute of Chinese Studies there. She did her PhD on a topic which is also very interesting for us from a music point of view, and that's also, I think, why this is so interesting anyhow, because she has a very strong focus in music also, and as I read in your biography, you wanted to also become a musician at some point. So her dissertation was on dangerous tunes, the politics of music in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the People's Republic of China since 1949. Her Habilitationsschrift was on a newspaper for China, Power, Identity and Change in Shanghai's New Media from 1872 to 1912. And she also got like a couple of awards. I want to mention the Heinz Meyer Leibniz Prize from 2000 and also from the American Philosophical Society in 2009 for a article, Popular Propaganda, Art and Culture in Revolutionary China, the Henry Allen Moe Prize. Recent research includes, and this is a lot, I just want to like name a couple of things, the rewriting of the history of cultural production under the Cultural Revolution in 1966 to 76, and she's also involved in a project or study of women magazines in China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan in the 19th century to the present, And she's also involved, oh no, this is actually sponsored by the Transcoop program of the Humboldt Foundation. And then of course, last but not least, which is very, very important in Germany, she's also being part of the Cluster of Excellence at the University of Heidelberg, Asia and Europe, shifting asymmetries in cultural flows. And today she will be talking about, as you can see, Wagner Goes East, China's encounters with European opera. So this project is becoming now really truly global with that Asian aspect. Barbara Mittler, please.
Thank you
the
very
stage
much.
is for you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and I'm really, really sorry that America or the US can only listen to half of what I'm going to say, because I actually designed this as a dialogue, and I hope that at least we can engage in this dialogue maybe later once this talk is put online. I was very, very amazed by how smoothly this works, and I spent a lot of time actually watching the two former talks and thinking about them, and my talk today is kind of a response to the two former talks that have already been given. Wagner Goes East. We know that Hector Berlioz was a strict man when it came to music. After the scandalous Tannhäuser performance in Paris in 1860, discussed last week, he is to have said that while this piece, and especially the overture, may have been one of Wagner's most popular at the time, he could not quite fathom why. He found the overture quite tiring, especially because of this one, and I quote him, whining motif in the strings, which dominates the melody throughout much of the piece, and indeed comes back some 142 times. And he asks, isn't that a bit much? Well, he concedes that there may be significance to such redundance, as he calls it. He concludes, yet this significance did not disclose itself to me, to be sure. So yes, Hector Berlioz is critical when it comes to music. When Hector Berlioz first listened to Chinese opera at the World Fair in 1851, he was even more disgruntled, however. What he heard were, in his words, not just incessantly repeated whining sounds, but wild cat howls, turkey cluckings, and death rattles. Certainly not anything like operatic music of the kind that he was appreciated of. Reacting to this type of critique, a French sinologist, Louis Laloy, in his 1910 publication, La Musique Chinoise, would say about Chinese opera that if a European ear is more surprised than charmed by such tumultuous sounds, we have to remember the words of that Chinese who, coming out of one of our opera houses, said to me, when one does not understand, one finds that there is too much noise. In drawing on evidence from some 150 years of operatic exchanges between China and Europe, what I will do today is to take issue just a little bit with Nicolas Varjoni's attractive formulation that Wagner was marketed globally in the 1850s already, that by the 1860s, and I quote him, the Wagner phenomenon had become international, even when his most famous works, those that would make him, in Varjoni's own words, truly go global, had not yet been composed. The question is, of course, who and what, and especially where the international and the global is actually situated. I will question Wagner's global impact as early as the mid-19th century, at least as far as China is concerned, by discussing precisely what Nicolas Varjoni has suggested last week. In presenting the case of China, I will ask, how has the performance of Wagner been introduced into different regions of the world? And how does Wagner function, and how is he understood in these places? I try to illustrate how the road was paved that leads from the kinds of Chinese reactions just mentioned, i.e. when one does not understand, one finds that there is too much noise, to those voiced at yet another World Fair, the Shanghai Expo in 2010, after the performance of Wagner's Ring. In Shanghai, the Chinese, otherwise well known for being a rather more reticent audience, never seemed to want to stop clapping anymore. Coming out of the performances, they were still bravoing. How then did China encounter European opera over the last 150 years or so? In answering this question, I will take up on an idea discussed by Thomas Betzwieser in his introductory reflections on performing anti-Semitic Wagner. He showed that the performance of Wagner, or of any music for that matter, is never innocent. Political and, as we've seen last week, commercial motivations inevitably play into the performance of music, opera or otherwise. And this may have a number of sometimes paradoxical effects that I also would like to deliberate here. And thus, I will, if in passing, respond to another of Nicolas Vassoni's questions posed last week, and mention how some opera companies have instrumentalized Wagner and the performance of The Ring to engage in their own self-marketing. Now, having done all this and explained how Wagner came to China, why and to what end, I will, at the end of the presentation, hopefully be able to reflect on something that leads us back to where we began, and to Berlioz's perception of Chinese opera. In trying to understand the complexities and many different levels of Wagner's reception in China, i.e. in trying to understand how the other receives European opera, we have to always bear in mind our own reception of that very other, its culture, its politics, and last but not least, its music. The presentation thus also deliberates the transcultural qualities of music and music making between China and Europe in the long 20th century. How global is Wagner really, and what does he, or when does he really go global after all? And I use this phrase, go global, quite ironically, as it is the Chinese government rhetoric for sending their firms out to take over the likes of IBM, to become Lenovo, and soon, perhaps, European banks, who knows? The first three of these questions will be addressed in parts 1 and 2 of the talk, where part 1 addresses the orange flag of this lecture series, that is globalization and markets, and the part 2 will address the brown flag, history and nationalism war. And the last question will then recur in the conclusion. Wagner, the brand and the market, the politics of the ring in China. I must begin finally, and I will do so, with something that happened just over a year ago in the fall of 2010, the performance of Robert Carson's production of The Ring, which in his interpretation becomes a parable of the perils of untamed industrialization, and was thus apparently a perfect fit with the better city, better life motif of the expo in Shanghai, which was to highlight the importance of sustainable economic development amidst the continuing global quest for rapid modernization. Throughout both Chinese and foreign critical acclaim, and it was praised for being a green ring, which put environmental destruction in focus. Of course, there were some conservative Chinese critics who asked whether it was really necessary to have these mythological figures appear in contemporary attire, but they were muted. Basically, everything was considered quite perfect and quite wonderful. And with the support of the International Association of Wagner Societies, this ring was then brought from Cologne to Shanghai as part of the German contribution to Expo 2010. This was, of course, not an easy undertaking, to be sure, as it encompassed transporting some 350 singers, musicians, staff, and stage workers, and some 30 containers of stage props to be moved to China in a voyage lasting 21 days and spanning some 14,000 kilometers. The opera cycle was performed twice at the Shanghai Grand Theater, and the performances were broadcast nationally by Shanghai Television to other parts of China. Here we have the television beginning image. Elke Heidenreich, who accompanied the Cologne team, she wrote a kind of diary in the FAZ, in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, and comments, "Der Ring für 1 Milliarde Zuschauer, das will schon etwas heißen. The Ring for 1 billion spectators, quite something." And indeed, the Green Ring in Shanghai turned out to be an enormous success. In some of the preliminary reports, spectacular sales are mentioned, especially considering that this was classical music, after all. On the last day of the performance, additional chairs had to be brought into the theater, while tickets were sold on the black market. Now I'm going to try and give you a report which is in Chinese, and I'll mute it and I will tell you what they are saying, but I want you to see what the reaction of the Chinese audience to the Ring was, and so that's why you're getting your first lesson in Chinese today. Okay, Command H, and then
观众毫不吝啬自己的掌声，经久不息的掌声在大剧院内整整响彻了近20分钟。
So the news report we're seeing here mentions that the audience was so enthusiastic about the performances that at the end of it all, it clapped for 20 minutes straight. Asked what they thought, they would shout, "Bravo!" Consider the performance incredible, or think of it as so wonderful that it would remain memorable to audiences in Shanghai. And here you see the audience there. The reporter says that the audience too had done a great job. They'd prepared and read the plots of the 4 plays, and they'd sustained a 16-hour. And here we have 16-hour performance. Here we have Uwe Erik Laufenberg, the artistic director from Cologne, who is quite impressed with the audience. And not only he, but the president of Shanghai's Grand Theatre, who will come up in a minute, Zhang Zhe, is very happy about the audience's discipline and stamina. That's him. He's saying, you know, that they actually held out and they didn't start calling on the phone and so on and so forth. That's quite admirable. This guy is Warren Mock, himself one of 3 star tenors in China, of whom we will hear more later. And he sums up that to have Wagner's Ring performed in Shanghai is a sign that Shanghai has now finally and truly become a global metropolis. Invariably, and I'll go back to my PowerPoint just so you can have the images. Now, invariably, all of the critical reviews and the advertisements and so on and so forth, the opera cycle is described in superlative terms. The enormous dimensions of the undertaking taken on by the Cologne Opera are illustrated when it is repeated time and again how many containers of stage props and how many participants, and now the Chinese reviews will call them 300, 350, 400 even, how many had to be moved from Germany all the way to Shanghai to make the performance possible. They also stress how long and how painstakingly Wagner had worked for 26 years to produce the opera, something that is appreciated, to be sure, by Chinese audiences who also have to work quite long hours. Quite accordingly, The Ring is considered a milestone, the greatest opera in history, and or something they call a super, an ultra, a hyper opera, 超级歌剧. This is so, explains one article, because more than other operas, Wagner's opera is, or Wagner's operas generally, are Gesamtkunstwerke, not drama in the service of music or music in the service of drama, but most accomplished music and most accomplished drama in one performance, in einem Guss, so to speak. Or put even more poetically, as does another Chinese critic, if opera as a genre is the crown of classical operatic practice, then Richard Wagner's Ring is the most beautiful, shining crown jewel. So the Ring is called the grandest, and all of this is in the Chinese newspapers, okay? The grandest, the longest opera ever seen performed in China, and precisely due to its enormous scale and length, it has always been considered impossible, basically, and the most unlikely opera to ever be performed in China. In China, as elsewhere, says Shanghai's Grand Theatre's director Zhang Guoyong, himself an acclaimed conductor, it is any conductor's greatest wish to be able to have a Wagner opera performed. Indeed, he could not quite believe that his dream would come true at this point. To him, the performance of The Ring in Shanghai was the high point of a cultural pilgrimage, as well as a great victory, that's what he says, for global culture. It also gave hope, so another Chinese critic contends, to all opera lovers for an ever better and ever richer operatic future to come. One Chinese musicologist, Liu Xuefeng, even asks in earnest how soon before China can produce its own Wagner. It does not seem so very impossible anymore. While the audience was quite impressed, as you have seen, so many standing ovations, so much clapping is not the usual call in China, as I said already. Apparently, even the Chinese solo cellist of the Cologne ensemble, Tian Bo-nian, had been quite nervous before they had gone to China. And he said, before we came here, I was quite worried whether the audience would be able to bear 15 hours of Wagner, whether they would be able to understand it, or whether the hall would be half empty after the break. Normally, Chinese are very guarded when it comes to clapping. Our experience at the end of Götterdämmerung is quite exceptional. Tian Bo-nian had not been sure whether Chinese audiences would be able to hear so much music in one stretch. Would they fall asleep? Would they begin to talk on their cell phones? The Shanghai newspaper Xinmin Wanbao also mentions explicitly, perhaps as a warning to audiences of the next parts of the ring, that none of this, no telephoning, no falling asleep, had happened, that everybody had behaved very well, and that the audience had come out of every one of these performances happy and moved. And Elke Heidenreich, too, in one of her diary reports, observes with quite some surprise how many young young Chinese had been there, how quiet they had been, how they would take photos, okay, but none of them would talk on the phone or among themselves. Instead, they listened, as she said, spellbound. Sie hörten gebannt zu. And she continues that when they, that is, she and the rest of the backstage team, were coming down the stairs from the office one of these days, and their ways crossed with the Chinese supernumeraries coming backstage, they had tears in their eyes, and they bowed to everyone from the German team, clapping. So they were really, really impressed. Her conclusion from all this is that nichts verbindet Menschen so wie die Kultur, vor allem die Musik. Nothing will tie humans together as much as music and culture does. Now this phrase, nichts verbindet Menschen so wie die Kultur, vor allem die Musik, is by no means an innocent phrase, and her next sentence reveals, as do many other remarks in her diary, how much of this undertaking of taking the ring to Shanghai was indeed political. She writes, nichts verbindet Menschen so wie die Kultur, vor allem die Musik. Wer erklärt das den Politikern, die immer noch glauben, an der Kultur zuerst sparen zu können? Nothing will tie humans together as much as does music and culture. Who's going to explain this, however, to all these politicians who believe that culture is the area where they can cut funds first? Later on, she complains about one of the Chinese in the audience who booed. Actually, the Chinese reports is very interesting. They're actually quite happy that there were some Chinese who booed. They said this is a sign that Chinese actually understand Wagner, that they were quite a sophisticated audiences, as the artistic director of the Cologne team had also said. Uwe Erich Laufenberg had said that exactly, they are a sophisticated audience. And the fact, in the Chinese reports it is said, the fact that they did not only clap but also booed, and righteously so, is mentioned there in quite a lot of detail, for indeed, as one critic says, Stig Anderson's performance had been lacking, his voice too small for the job. He just couldn't sustain the 5 hours of singing. Elke Heidenreich, on the other hand, has a different take on this booing, and again links it back to German local politics. Jeden Abend donnernder Applaus. Nur einer buht immer. Bei jedem Sänger, beim Orchester, beim Dirigenten, buh, buh, buh. Der sitzt 17 Stunden Musik ab, um persönlich Richard Wagner fertig zu machen. Den knöpfe ich mir morgen vor und erzähle ihm von der Kölner Stadtverwaltung, die auch nicht begreift, was für ein Weltklasse-Orchester sie hat und die in dumpfer Provinzialität das alles hier gar nicht ahnt. Buh, buh. Und dann empfehle ich dem Buhmann und den Kölner Kulturignoranten doch mal in Shanghai in den schönen Zhuozhongyuan-Park zu gehen, den Garten des bescheidenen Beamten, ein bisschen aufs Gras zu blicken und nachzudenken. What she says is every evening, raving applause. Just one Chinese is booing all the time with every one of the singers, the orchestra, the conductor. He sits through 17 hours of music just in order to beat, to mop and wear down Richard Wagner. Tomorrow I'll go over to meet him and tell him about the Cologne city administration, and they too don't even know that they have a world-class orchestra. So dumb are they in their provinciality that they don't even know what is going on here. Boo, boo. And then I recommend to this Boo guy, as well as to the cultural ignorance in Cologne, that they should go to Shanghai. In fact, it's in Suzhou, right? They should go to Suzhou and visit the Zhuozheng Yuan. This is the humble administrator's garden. And that they should watch the grass a bit there and think about things. So what is clearly at stake here is quite a lot of local German politics, which has in fact very little to do with Wagner's music and its introduction to China. The Ring performance and its mediatic presentation in Germany becomes a way to discuss German problems. Yet there are, and of course, but this is in the internet, so this is everywhere, right? Yet there are other comments that have to do with China and can be considered equally political. Remember that this guy, Tian Buanian, the solo cellist of the orchestra, who is Chinese, was worried whether the audience would be able to understand Wagner. He explains, or should one say he apologizes, that there are so few operatic performances in China and that only very few Chinese orchestras are actually able to play European operatic music, let alone Wagner. And that therefore to experience the Ring in Shanghai was special not just for him, but for the audience as well. Many of them only knew the music of Wagner's Ring from CDs, but had never seen it performed. Well, I have never seen it performed, but anyway. Heidenreich argues in the same direction when she observes that the Chinese had been quiet, all right, but then, about half an hour later, she says, some 30 or 40 of them get up to come back a few minutes later. They'd visited the bathroom. Evidently, they did not know Rheingold. 2.5 hours, no break. And listen to the German, I mean, it's offensichtlich, wussten sie nicht. Rheingold, 2,5 Stunden, keine Pause. Poor, ignorant guys, one might add, adding injury to insult. Now, of course, this may be considered humorous, and I'm sure that Heidenreich meant it that way. But both her and Tian Buanian's comments are condescending, nevertheless, a condescension that recurs throughout the diary and many of the other press reports that you have, the foreign reports on the event. Heidenreich continues in one section and where she talks about this Chinese guy who has to be delivered to a hospital due to palpitations he gets from watching the performance. In her words, he, as so many in the audience, is spellbound. After each act, she observes, the audience almost explodes. The final applause, she says, begins already into the last few bars. The emotional tension simply is too high for the Chinese to bear, right? Das chinesische Publikum ist so gebannt, dass es nach jedem Akt fast explodiert. Und der Schlussbeifall kommt noch in die letzten Takte hinein. Man hält die emotionale Spannung einfach nicht mehr aus. Auf der Bühne klappt alles. Um Brünnhilde lodert, und ich hoffe, das lodert, genau, es lodert ein wunderbares Feuer. Ein starker Eindruck. So stark, dass ein junger Chinese mit Herzrasen ins Krankenhaus muss. No, this is the kind of condescension. I mean, I think I love her. She's great, she's funny. But anyway, this is the kind of condescension that is very dangerous when it comes to China. For there are always so many that will be able to prove you wrong. Not only had some of the Shanghai audience come well prepared, as we've seen. A series of introductory lectures provided them with information about Wagner and his work, introducing both musical and philosophical aspects of the Ring, its leitmotifs and the theme of love as the kernel to all understanding of the opera. And all of these experts were Chinese specialists who'd been to Bayreuth many, many times, as the advertisement will tell you. Moreover, the Shanghai performance of the Ring was not the first in China. Only 5 years earlier, in 2005, the country had seen the first complete performance of the Ring. And this was the Nuremberg State Theater's production of Wagner's Ring des Nibelungen. And even earlier, in 2001, the China Philharmonic Orchestra had performed Act 1 of Die Walküre, featuring American soprano cellist Dara Sieglinde, a role that she would then again perform in 2005. So, while this was the first complete staging of the opera cycle in China, and the reactions then were quite enthusiastic, as well, Chinese critics called the performance incomparable, 不可比性的, and a unique opportunity for Chinese audiences. It had been feared in Beijing too, as the foreign press reports will tell you, that the Chinese would fall asleep. Only few, if any, actually did. As one English press report recalls, initially they behaved as if witnessing a performance of Peking opera, and the auditorium was a lively and distracting place. However, Wagner's music gradually worked its magic, and the emergence of familiar concepts such as family tensions, struggles for power, and star-crossed lovers, not to mention dragons and other mythical beasts, soon convinced them that there was much cultural common ground. The fairy tale quality of Siegfried in particular found a responsiveness that is rare today amongst Western audiences, but certainly applied to audiences of Wagner's own time. Naive, little, ignorant Chinese. And they go on to say, somewhere in his essay on art and revolution, Wagner writes that the artwork of the future is intended to express the spirit of free people irrespective of national boundaries. The national element in it must be no more than an ornament, an added individual charm, and not a confining barrier. He would have been gratified, the article continues, to know that in China's capital, a large audience was attentively following his words with the help of subtitles in Mandarin, and that his masterwork was at last being performed in the most populous nation on earth. Now, the tenor of these articles is, the world is bringing great operatic art to China, but really, will the Chinese children understand? Of course they will, I would say. And can they play it? Of course they can. But because much has changed since, during a concert visit in 1986, Luciano Pavarotti expressed his single regret that the capital of the world's most populous nation should be without a suitable opera theater. He was unhappy because he thought there was no opera theater. And in fact, there were, but he just didn't see them. While he was unhappy then about that, he himself witnessed that opera singers were trained, and successfully so, in some of the master classes he taught, that were attended not just by the students who were being taught by him, but by full audiences, eager to learn, reading his lips, but already quite accomplished too. And I want to show you one of these scenes from the master class that he's giving, because I think it is rather impressive. Now, where did it go? Can we find it? Is it here? Here, okay. We have to move it up. Yeah, okay. All right, so, and probably move the sound so you can hear what's happening. This time, you don't need any Chinese. Here.
Bella tecnica. Questo si chiama Musetta Valzer. Allora è necessario.
See this audience? Now watch this woman.
Soletta per, soletta per, quando vengo soletta per, quando vengo soletta per. Don't rush.
以前别快，住 soletta 级。
Quando vengo soletta per, soletta, yeah. Before, no. Dammi I tuoi occhiali.
This audience, okay. They're all watching this, they're all singers themselves, they all want to know how this goes. Okay. All right, let's go back. So Pavarotti thinks there are no opera houses. Actually, there are opera houses, and then many new opera houses are being built in the last 3 decades. Performances of European opera in China have become a matter of course. A quick look through the programs of some of the larger venues that there are, such as the National Center for the Performing Arts in Beijing, colloquially described as the egg, you probably heard this description already, shows this very clearly. In August alone, there were 3 performances, Verdi's Rigoletto, Donizetti's l'Élysée d'Amour, and Puccini's La Bohème. The Central Opera Troupe, resident in Beijing and established in 1952, already has and continues to stage many world classics such as Madame Butterfly, Carmen, Figaro's Hochzeit, and Turandot. In 1986, the opera troupe cooperated with Luciano Pavarotti, as you just saw, to stage La Bohème. And in June 2001, together with the 3 tenors, they performed at the Forbidden City for the 2008 Olympic bid, which, as you all know, they also won. We will just see this performance because it is quite impressive. Just a short bit of it, okay? It's in the Forbidden City.
Partene bastimenti per terra assai lontane, cantano a bordo son napolitane. Cantano petramente, come il foggia sul quale ad una mezza mano poco e Napoli le fa.
Okay, I'm stopping you. Of course, this is superb. But China now has not just one set of 3 tenors, but actually 2 sets of 3 tenors already, and you will see them in a minute. Here we are. And they are superb. Of course, China appreciates the originals visiting. There are obviously many Chinese, however, today who can sing just as well. And this, too, may be part and parcel of the tone in and the politics behind foreign reports on opera in China. Indeed, there is another side to the coin: fear. On December 2nd, 2010, the New York Times titles "Go East, Young Diva," and asks, is China poised to become next opera superpower? Opera once was the pinnacle of European art, but is it dying in the West? And the article reads, for 400 years, no art form has been more closely identified with Western culture than opera. At the heart of every great European city stands an opera house. Over the centuries, it became the center of intellectual and social life, the place where the aristocracy gambled and partied, the rising bourgeoisie conversed, the artistic avant-garde sought inspiration. From Baroque to postmodern, opera librettos mirror the modern history of the West. Yet opera is dying in the West. The most popular romantic operas, works like Aida, Turandot, and Tristan and Isolde, can no longer be cast with singers of the high quality lovingly remembered and immortalized in recordings from only a few decades ago. Charismatic artists like Maria Callas did sort of this 19th century romantic opera, that transformed opera into a universally acclaimed art form. These remain the operas audiences want to hear. Yet where are the singers? The music director of the Metropolitan Opera, James Levine, waxes nostalgic about the singers he conducted there 40 years ago. They were sensationally full-scale in every artistic way. I'd give so much to hear them sing again. But help is on the way, and from an unexpected direction, the East. The article then continues to explain that while opera has always been a globalized profession, of course, singers traveling throughout Europe and across the Atlantic and so on and so forth to ply their trade, they've always been a scarce commodity. And in the author's view, opera is also kind of like professional sports. Technical and physical demands push its superstars to the limit. In any generation of singers, he says, few can hit the high seas or project over Wagner's extravagant orchestration for 5 hours at night. Even fewer can do so with elegance, drama, and musical depth. As with athletes, producing such singers requires that experts sift through millions of young people to find the talented few, provide decades of dedicated training, and reward them with enough fame and riches to make the tedium and personal risk worthwhile. And of course, you know the Tiger Mother, in his view, Asian students, Chinese students display a fierce commitment to education, powerful work ethic, and a strict sense of discipline. Obviously, in his reading, the country with the greatest potential for this is China. With an estimated 30 million piano students and 10 million violin students, the number auditioning for conservatories has increased from a few thousand 20 years ago to nearly 200,000 today. Quite accordingly, China is now stocking the world's orchestras, and Chinese opera stars have also begun emerging. The bass Hao Jiangtian, of whom we will hear later, has sung for decades in the Metropolitan. While he concedes that it may be too soon to know whether Asia will save opera, and is not sure whether Shanghai will become an operatic Mecca, after all, to him, nothing demonstrates the ironies of globalization more clearly than the possibility that the future of opera, the most venerable of Western performing arts, may depend on Asia. I seem to read some regret into this statement, but I would argue, and I will take up this thread in the final section of this presentation, that there is in fact no need for regret, no need for crisis scenarios. China has simply joined the game as one global player in a growing musical field that enriches both Europe and Asia. And in the next section, we'll zoom back to the beginning of European opera history in China to question how this came about. Building a path for Wagner in China, a view from history. How did it all begin? I'll have a quick look back in time to let you catch a few glimpses of the beginnings and further developments of the operatic soundtrack, if you will, that has actually been audible in China since the late 19th century to answer the questions of how and when Wagner gets to China and what the consequences of this were. Remember French sinologist Louis Laloy, who would remind us of that Chinese who came out of one of our opera houses and said when one does not understand, one finds that there is too much noise. Indeed, in the early 20th century, for example in 1908 and then also into the 1920s and 30s, the gramophone, those who wanted to sell gramophones in China didn't advertise them using Caruso and Western operatic singers or anything like that. No, they advertised it with Chinese opera. It may be difficult for you to tell in the first example from 1908, but you can believe me that 1, 2, 3, the fourth line from the right says that it's for Jingju, and for other types of operatic forms, this can be used and you can listen to this. In fact, a lot of these gramophone firms, EMI in Colombia, the largest active in Asia, would engage in recording Chinese opera stars in order to sell their gramophones better. The paradoxical outcome of this was the heyday of Chinese opera, which can be dated to around 1917 to 1937, and this was triggered or even created by this obviously purely commercial foreign interest in what they would call wild cat howls and turkey cluckings in Chinese opera. Now, was there an attempt in instructing the Chinese and the European traditions at all? Surely there were attempts and there were hopes that, you know, we want to introduce our opera to the Chinese. But how to do it and how to do it properly, there were fights about that. And there's this one very funny article in the North China Herald of 1908 again, in which they defute. They don't want to, they say it's too expensive to bring a huge opera company to Shanghai. On the other hand, this other scheme that they thought up with having film and gramophone sort of perform an opera is maybe also not so good. I proposed the scheme to bring out the Scala Grand Opera Company to Shanghai, and thus for the first time to present classical opera in Far Eastern cities. We've been reading of an ingenious enterprise meditated by some continental firm to play grand opera on the cinematograph with full accompaniment of gramophones instructed by the best singers and orchestra. But in all seriousness, it seems extremely doubtful whether such a form of entertainment can prosper, or whether, if it did, it would not be detrimental to the best interests of music. That music generally, and opera in particular, ought to be popularized, we all agree, but in receiving opera through the medium of cinematograph and gramophone, there's so much danger that our interest might center in the mere admiration aroused by an extremely wonderful toy. So, while around the turn of the century, the missionary harmonium, the brass instruments of the military bands, and the so-called school songs were pretty well known. School songs were basically European songs like Bruder Jakob, Frère Jacques, and songs like that, that were now taught in the schools, that were no longer just teaching Confucian classics. And slowly also the piano, all of these instruments, piano sort of became a status symbol for the educated, and would be part and parcel of the musical experience open to basically any urban Chinese. European opera, and this is actually an interesting advertisement, as you can see. It's very, very discriminatory. And it's not very nice to the Chinese, right? Nothing is saved by buying a native-made, i.e. Chinese piano, right? Those Shanghai pianos, no good. Buy a real one. Buy a Bechstein, and so on and so forth. So all of these things were part and parcel of normal living of an urban Chinese. But European opera was not part of the fair, and this was so in spite of the fact that traveling opera troupes had been coming to Shanghai since 1875. It is interesting that in the North China Herald, that is the English language newspaper in Shanghai, you will find advertisements where the Chinese are trying to get their operatic art to be appreciated by Westerners. And they even sort of self-deprecatory, they even do things in order to make this possible. So for example, they translate the texts, the Chinese text into English so that the Westerners can better understand. Or they talk to the actors in such a way that they will act according to foreign ideas of propriety. And they do all this to attract the foreign audience to their particular types of theatricals. The Westerners, on the other hand, don't put any ads in the Chinese language papers. They only have ads in the English language papers for the kinds of operas and operettas and opera comique and so on and so forth that were being performed in Shanghai. In the Chinese language newspaper, the Shenbao, the Shanghai Chinese language newspaper, there are a few articles on opera, and they show very clearly that, but they are few and far between basically, they show very clearly that the Chinese had an understanding already by the 19-teens of what Western opera was, European opera was, and what Chinese opera was. The Chinese were clearly never, as you can see here from this audience picture, the majority in the audience, but the Chinese must have been there. In 1927, there was an article by this guy who remembers that in 1915, he watched Othello, he watched the Verdi opera in one of these performances by one of the traveling opera troupes. So Chinese were in the audience, but there were few of them. And Chinese knew about foreign opera, European opera, and but what they did all the time in these articles, that every 5 years you find one article on opera in these Chinese language newspapers, so not a lot, but anyway. And what they always do in these articles is compare European opera with Chinese opera and say, how could we bring the two together? How could we combine the two together? And then actually there appear to be also performances where these two things are put together. And so here, you have a Chinese opera actor in obviously a situation, operatic situation, where there's not just Chinese acting taking place. So there was an interaction both, especially from the Chinese side, I would say, with an interaction with the operatic tradition, the new operatic tradition that was coming into China. And Wagner does play a role in many of these articles. Wagner is already in one of the earliest articles, which appears in 1919. His leitmotif technique is described in such a wonderful way in Chinese. In Chinese, it says it's something, a melody that sticks in your mind. And I just thought this is a very nice way of describing it. It's very, very acute, and it shows extremely that they have understood exactly what is going on in Wagner operas. In 1923, there is another article on Wagner's particular operatic style, and this article then mentions Sprechgesang, and actually compares Sprechgesang with the type of Yunbai, which is a kind of recitative type of speaking in Chinese opera that you will also be seeing some of later. So there is an interest, and there is also knowledge, quite a lot of knowledge about both Chinese and Western or European operas. But there is no mention, and this is really very, very strange, until the mid-1920s there is no mention of these operatic troops that keep coming every 1-2 years. Shanghai has an Italian, an English, not German, but anyway, lots of European troops coming to Shanghai. And the performances are kind of interesting. I mean, they're doing Il Trovatore, Lucia di Lammermoor, La Traviata, Un ballo in maschera, Il barbiere di Siviglia. I mean, Faust Gounod, Rigoletto, all kinds of Weber's Freischütz, and then a lot of sort of light stuff, Offenbach and the likes, and Gilbert and Sullivan in the 1880s. Those are the great hits. And so there are lots and lots of performances, and most of them take place in this theater. This is the 1930s version of this theater, but basically it exists since the 1870s, kept getting ramshackle and had to be rebuilt. And was rebuilt because so many people wanted to go and see the performances in this theater. What is interesting about these operatic performances, in the early years, of course, there was no big orchestra. These opera troupes couldn't bring, 25 musicians with them and 30 boxes like the Ring production of containers with props. And so basically, it was always also a Shanghai affair when they performed these operas in Shanghai. So there would be, a violinist in Shanghai who was quite good, and he would then perform with the piano player and the singers by this opera troupe. And so, it was very sort of intimate and very familiar atmosphere in which all of these great pieces were being performed. By the turn of the century, and this is when Wagner actually arrives in China, by the turn of the century in 1905, you have the formation of the Shanghai Band, which later becomes the Shanghai Symphonic Orchestra, and the Shanghai Band in November 1905 has an inaugural concert, and this inaugural concert is all Wagner, basically. Tannhäuser, not all Wagner, it's not true. Cavalleria Rusticana, Tannhäuser, Faust, Oberon, Lohengrin, und Balla in Maschera. Then in June 1908, 25 years after the death of Wagner, the conductor of this Shanghai Band has another program comprised of 6 orchestral selections from Jensi, Tannhäuser, Meistersinger von Nürnberg, Ring des Nibelungen, and in addition to that, he also has some vocal selections given by a soprano and a tenor singing. So this is in 1905 and the following years. This is when Wagner actually comes to China as a soundbite. not in the 1850s. We're not that global yet, but in 1905. I could go on and on and on with this history. The most important part of it is there was a lot of operatic life. There were a lot of theaters, and I just show you some of them, in Shanghai, both European and Asian, if you want. There was a lot of soundbite. There was a soundtrack that contained not just Chinese opera, very prominently Chinese opera, but also a lot of European opera as well. And, you know, there was Boris Godunov, there was Carmen, there was La Traviata. You could listen to all of these things. You could participate, actually, in all of these things. And you could say, you know, that if we say 1905 is when Wagner gets to China, 1937 is the moment when China gets to Wagner, because 1937 is the first performance of this Shanghai band, that then is the Shanghai Orchestra, with 2 Chinese singers. So finally, the Chinese have taken over this part of musical life as well. The foundation of the Shanghai Conservatory in 1927, of course, is one of the steps on this way, but there has been a lot of music making among Chinese, especially in the urban areas, and especially in cities like Shanghai, all throughout the early 20th century. So how far are we now? I need to somehow also get to an end. So far I've answered 3 of the 4 questions. I've shown how European opera has been introduced to China, that it was available in performances which began in select cities like Shanghai in the late 19th century, that is locally, and that it was first available maybe only to foreigners. Then later, with the introduction of the gramophone and increasing numbers of theaters built and musical events held, also opened to a growing number of Chinese, if still not a great crowd. I mean, these are urban Chinese, and these are very specific urban Chinese, but still, these guys who did know knew this stuff really, really well. Now, the communist regime did not, as is often thought, undermine the presence of European opera. To the contrary, one can argue that they were crucial to the dissemination of the sounds and instruments of European classical music, which was part and parcel of their so-called model works. And here you have some model ballets, and here you have some model operas. They were seminal to the semantics, the leitmotif techniques, the Wagnerian leitmotif techniques are seminal to the semantics of these. In order to show who the hero is and who the negative character is, isn't there a better way than using a leitmotif? And that's what they did. And so they have, it's very, very interesting, the bad characters, the leitmotif of the bad characters always has the ambitus of Diabolus in Musica, in augmented force. So we know, not Diabolus in Musica, but Diabolus in the play is coming in when the leitmotif sounds. So, you know, the communists, because then these model works were disseminated into the urban areas. There were films made of these model works, of the symphonic works, the ballets, and then also these so-called revolutionary operas. And they were disseminated all over China. And that's when the violin becomes a real, a memorable sound bite in rural China. And so, you know, the 60s and 70s, the times that we usually associate with everything is shut up and nobody listens to any Western music anymore, and so on and so forth. This is the time when the majority of the Chinese population is, for the first time in their lives, many of them, confronted with the sounds of Tchaikovsky-like Chinese music, okay? Now, then we get to the early 1970s, and we have ping-pong diplomacy, and of course we have all these orchestras coming to China, and more and more and more sound bites are getting in. Then we have cassette tapes, CDs, CD-ROMs, DVDs. Then we have TV and radio that also help transmit all of these things. So I've answered basically all the questions that were there. The question of the function of European opera and how it was understood in China, and the many political and commercial motivations behind performances of European opera, or the apparent denial to perform it, as in the case of the gramophone firms, who quite paradoxically then sort of improve the dissemination of Chinese opera by burning them, not burning them, but putting them onto LPs. The last question, however, the fourth question, when and how does Wagner and European opera more generally go global, 走出去, right, still needs to be addressed, and I will do this now in the conclusion. Operatic encounters from Wagner's nationalist cosmopolitanism to China's post-nationalist transculturalism. I have copied and basically stolen my predecessors. The next talk's title. She will talk about nationalist cosmopolitanism, and I will say a little bit about that. How much time do I have? Can I still make you listen to something, a sound bite that I think is quite significant? Now, where has it gone? Wir machen das mal zu. Den können wir auch mal zu. Ja. Da ist es. Okay.
Modern Chinese opera. The I Sing Beijing program was funded by the Chinese government, but as NPR's Louisa Lim reports from Beijing, one man with a remarkable life story made it happen.
Lesson number 1, saying thank you in Chinese. For American soprano Maria McDaniel, this is the start of a linguistic journey into another culture. She's one of 20 American and European singers who recently spent a month in Beijing learning to sing modern Chinese operas.
There are no lips. Oh, right, and it's very frontal.
Her days are packed with language lessons and one-on-one workshops. McDaniel says she's keen to explore China as a possible market of the future, given the dwindling opportunities for opera singers at home.
Many prominent opera companies have closed their doors. Much more have had to cut down on their seasons, the number of productions, and then the number of jobs are shrinking. So that was another reason that fueled my interest in coming over here and exploring.
She's learning to sing a role from a modern Chinese opera called Chinese Orphan. At the end of the month, each of the singers will perform an aria. They'll sing at the most prestigious venue in China, Beijing's National Center for the Performing Arts.
This is a very special day for me.
This is the brainchild of Haojiang Tian, a Chinese opera singer who's made it on the international stage. Once a factory worker, he arrived in the US penniless, knowing just 3 words of English. Within a decade, he was performing at the Met. He hopes this program will reduce the kind of discrimination he faced when he tried to break into opera in the West.
I had some terrible experiences with the directors, conductors, and the managers too, and because still, this is a Western opera, Western culture. The first rehearsal, if I don't know this conductor, director, my singing colleagues, and I could see lots of question marks in their eyes. This is Chinese, can he sing?
Yet new contemporary Chinese music is having a bigger impact in the West, and Tian has premiered in a clutch of high-profile pieces, including The First Emperor of the Met, written by composer Tan Dun. Tian points out that China's economic boom is also creating a cultural boom.
Everybody knows the economy is really growing fast, so there are lots of money here and there, and so every city wants to become an international city, so they build an opera house. Government really put in lots of money for cultural events and developments.
With his program, Tian has come back to where he started. He takes the singers and a documentary crew to visit a Beijing boiler factory where he spent 6 years working on a steel cutting machine. As the cameras roll, together with his old colleagues, he belts out a forbidden American folk song, which back then they used to sing secretly. The most moving moment comes when a group of young factory workers start singing their factory anthem. This turns out to be Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. The new lyrics include a mention of how the company is burning its chest to warm the earth. The opera singers join in, their polished chorus providing the perfect counterpoint to the workers. At this moment, the two halves of Tian's life have come together. Maria McDaniel voices the mood.
Now, this is typical scandalizing language of the media. The report, however, does convey, I think, an important message. The tide is turning. And indeed, to produce and create operatic works is no longer just a European reserve and privilege. The cultural boom in China, in addition to a long history of music making that makes Beethoven's Freude schöner Götterfunken a familiar melody even to the factory workers, all of this, but not only that, means that we have now turned to the other side of the coin, that things are shifting, things are moving, and if we look at a piece like Tan Dun's Marco Polo, we'll see how this also brings us back to the beginning of this talk and Hector Berlioz' description of Chinese opera. And here again, I will play you a little bit and I will talk over, so I will make this. So we see here is an excerpt from a documentary on a retake of Tan Dun's opera Marco Polo in Amsterdam in 2008. And this guy, Zhang Jun, is a Kunqu opera actor. He plays Rustichello in Marco Polo's piece. And he explains the use of Kunqu recitation techniques that I mentioned earlier and how they are being used in Marco Polo. And he says he's reading this one sentence.
As the book of time space open.
If he's reading this sort of this way, then of course it becomes something completely different. Let's listen.
都会有这样的想法，我们要把自己中国的东方的艺术能够传播到西方去，能够影响更多的西方的朋友对中国的一些认识，影响西方主流的艺术。但是我觉得其实是很艰难的。
我觉得昆曲比西方的歌剧还要早100-200年，在它的形成方面，我觉得是中国最为上层建筑、最为精神化，也可以说是最为贵。
What he said in the end, and I think that's also very, very important, he demonstrates that and says that many of us who are performing and producing Chinese music have the same mission. He says we want to show our Eastern art and transfer our art to the Western world. We want to explain it to the Western world. We want it to become part of Western mainstream art. But this is, of course, not easy. Marco Polo, as I think is evident from the images that I have shown you, uses much musical stereotyping, both of Western and of Eastern musical styles. You've seen the sitar and the tabla playing, as well as Tibetan bells, but there is also Gregorian chant and, of course, Chinese opera. But in doing so, it produces a kind of meta-commentary, so it seems to me, on musical exoticism, which in turn is what creates the difference between a Turandot by Puccini and a Marco Polo by Tan Dun. And I'll come back to that. Names like Guo Wenzing, Qu Xiaosong, and of course Tan Dun are becoming increasingly commonplace to European and North American operatic stages. The Western audience is, I quote, enchanted by the rhythmic speech, the haunting melodies, the percussion that violently interrupts the narrative. In their works, it identifies with the emotion, delights in the music, and ultimately succumbs to the magic of spectacle. These works fascinate their audiences by taking up elements from Chinese operatic art. They thus infiltrate and enrich the European operatic tradition with new gestures, masks, and, I would argue, new sounds as well. Why does everyone need Chinese opera? This is the title of one chapter of Alexander Huang's study of Chinese Shakespeare's. And I want to show you the image of this here. This is the book. Now, this book deals with the foreign reception of Chinese-style operatic versions of Shakespeare, and Huang speaks of an infatuation with Asian visuality. According to him, Chinese opera, Shakespeare's, seems to cross national boundaries in the global marketplace with ever greater facility and an unprecedented degree of translatability. If film has become the lingua franca of the 20th century, the success of Chinese opera in recent decades is testimony to the rise, he says, of Asian visuality in the global scene. I would say that there is more to it, however, and that reactions to Chinese-style operas, both by Chinese and by non-Chinese composers alike, recently show that we've come full circle from Hector Berlioz, who heard but wild cat house, turkey cluckings and death rattles in performances of Chinese opera, and our Chinese theatergoer who considered European opera too much noise, while Chinese audiences have long since been appreciative, trained to understand European opera. European audiences are now beginning to appreciate Chinese opera. And what is developing, therefore, is not just a globally accepted visual language in stylized performance, as Alexander Huang is observing in his book, but a musical one as well. The performance of Turandot in Beijing was one, Zhang Yimou, the film director, was sort of directing this Turandot in Beijing, was one step in this direction. The commission of Chinese composer Hao Weiya to compose a new ending to the fragmented work, Turandot, is another, and the success of Chinese operatic works such as Tan Dun's Marco Polo, I think, brings us back to where we began. As Chinese audiences have begun to accept the sounds of Wagner and the like as anything else than too much noise, foreign audiences have begun to appreciate Chinese opera, wild cat house, turkey cluckings and death rattles. In an increasingly open audio-visual world, there is no Götterdämmerung to be expected for opera, to be sure. The types of changes introduced by Chinese as well as foreign composers to operas old and new alike have actively participated in the defamiliarization process of these in a global marketplace where newness frequently enters as a precious commodity. The challenge of encounters between Chinese opera and Richard Wagner is taken up manifold, not least in Arno Nordegraf's planned opera As Big as the Sky, which features a Chinese soprano, a Finnish baritone, the Chinese instrument sheng, percussion, ensemble soundtracks and video, and in which Chinese opera and quotes from Wagner clash and merge to form one whole. From the nationalist cosmopolitanism that Wagner and his works enjoyed throughout the 19th century, as Nicolas Vajoni so admirably showed last time, we've now entered, I would say, a post-nationalist transculturalism in which European and Chinese opera appear no longer as distinctly demarcated nationalist soundbites, but instead as global resonances to be employed with increasing ease and competence, both in those parts of the world that I have called Europe throughout this presentation, as well as those that are frequently called Asia, and certainly in China. And to me, as China is the world, this is what it means to say that Wagner has indeed truly gone global. He's gone global now, today, which is perhaps why, to answer Arno von Mungen's first question, and also the question that lies, I think, behind this entire lecture series, why someone like Wagner is still so very important today, because, and Arno Mungen also said this, culture creates more culture, and that's what we've seen, I think, here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara Mittler, for this extremely rich paper, really putting Wagner in a very broad context, not only of reception of opera in China, but also of globalization nowadays, talking of course about reception and talking about media as well. So thank you so much. So are there questions here? I know there might be a question on the phone very soon, but Nicolas was not able to see the second part because the live stream did not work there. So, okay. But are there questions here for now?
No question.
Thomas.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for this highly illuminating paper. I have a lot of questions, but I try to limit them on Wagner. Of particular interest, I think, is the mixed, what you call the mixed operatic performances, but maybe we can talk on that later. First question is, I think it was quite interesting, this term of global metropolis, what has been used in the context of the Shanghai performance. And actually the Ring has called it a sort of hyper opera. I would like to know what are the criteria for this global metropolis within the whole context. Obviously, Wagner is one of the criteria, but what are the others for this global metropolis? The second question concerns the behavior of the audience. A long talk on this. Actually, it seems to be a problem. But I would like to support your argument of course. Yeah, of course, they can bear 15 hours of music and sitting in a normal position, so to speak. But I would like to know what is behind this discussion. What is the form of reception of the traditional Chinese opera? Because there must be reasons for that. When people say it was quite surprising that the audience was sitting like that. On the other hand, I think an audience clapping during the last chords of the opera must be quite instructed, must be quite informed when this opera ends, actually. So these were two questions.
Yeah, about the global metropolis, this was said by this one Chinese tenor, right? And basically I think what he means in this instance when he's saying that is that we have arrived in the world. We are now, Shanghai is just as good a city as Berlin or any other city, or Bayreuth, right? Where the Ring can be performed. And there is a kind of catching up mentality still, sort of in the Chinese mind, and I think this also becomes very, very clear in Tian Bonyan's, in this cellist, solo cellist, Cologne solo cellist type of rhetoric, and this is what is meant. There's not a lot else behind this, but this catching up. Catch-up mentality, we call it, among sinologists. As for the discussion behind the audience being loud, of course, the original setup for Chinese opera is such that it's in a tea house, and you sit on the table, and on the stage something is going on, but you might as well, crack your whatever snacks you have, and eat something and drink, sip tea and talk to your neighbor and so on and so forth. But this setup has long since changed, and Chinese opera has also been performed in stage halls in the same way that the sort of Western type performances would be performed. And so of course there is a long tradition of having gotten used to this type of sitting through 15 hours of music, if necessary. And so this sort of going back to this old story is kind of like going back, well, spitting onto the streets is still not such an old story, but it's also something that sort of goes back to old colonial discourses about how the Chinese cannot behave. And it's kind of worrying that 100 years later we're still using the same kind of rhetoric, and we're still employing the same kind of prejudices when we meet with a Chinese audience. And we sort of do not reflect on how much better they actually know their Mozart than they know their Chinese opera sometimes. In fact, more often than not, it is such that children grow up more on Western music than they grow up on Chinese music, and therefore it is absolutely not natural that a composer like Tan Dun would employ Chinese music. In fact, this generation of composers who employs Chinese music is the generation of composers who was sent to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution, and only because of that are they able to employ more of that traditional Chinese, or actually even local Chinese music, than the older generation and the younger generation. And so, this authenticity debate, yeah, that sort of thinks a Chinese must know Chinese music, is absolutely incorrect and is one of these prejudices that go, with the type of behavior that you are doing in the tea house when you're listening to Beijing opera. That's no longer applicable to China in the 21st century. And I think we have to move on in our perception of this country as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions?
Was that a question?
I have a question. I also would have a lot of questions actually, because I thought it was absolutely amazing how you were able to contextualize that relationship Europe-Asia or Europe-China through opera. But also talking about Wagner, do you think, I was asking myself during more or less the whole of the presentation, why is it that people want to bring Wagner to China, for example? And I was wondering, do you think there's something like an international competition, almost like in sports, because you brought that up at one point within the cultural sphere and within opera? Would that be also to be observed for China? What do you think?
It's difficult for me to answer because I'm really not a Wagner specialist. So I wouldn't know, how much effort is put into bringing Wagner to Brazil and bringing Wagner to Africa. But I'm sure, that the lecture series will illuminate us all on these questions. And I think there is an interest in bringing Wagner to the world. And that's the interest partly of the Wagner societies around the International Wagner Society, as far as I understood them. But on the other hand, there is, of course, as you've seen, I think, from the people I quoted, because I try to sort of balance Chinese voices and foreign voices in this presentation, there is also a very, very strong mission among sort of the Chinese voices that they want to bring Wagner to China because they then feel part of this global world of music. And sort of the sound of music has arrived in China if Wagner has also, the Ring has been performed in China. And so it's two sides, I think, working together, sort of, actually not working together, but there is a common cause that can then lead to two Ring performances within 5 years. I mean, that's pretty spectacular. It's pretty good. One in Beijing, one in Shanghai.
The other question I would ask after this is, it seems like the highest goal within that competition is to stage your own ring, to doing your own thing. I mean, this is very speculative, but how would a Chinese ring staged on their own look like? I was thinking, looking at these what you call model operas, these pictures. What would be like a Chinese interpretation of that work? Of course, we don't know this, but do you have any idea on this?
I have my own ideas. See, there are actually quite a few people like Zhang Yimou, like directors and artistic directors, and then also, of course, composers and musicians who will have ideas that sort of go along this line. We have to have a Chinese ring, right? But actually, I find it more and more difficult to deal with these terms. That's why I try to sort of sneak in transculturality at the end of the talk. Because these model operas, they are so un-Chinese as you get it, right? They're basically romantic, it's romantic music. It's using all the Tchaikovskyan harmonies and everything. It's basically Tchaikovsky with a little bit of pentatonicism. I actually call it pentatonic romanticism, because this is what this is. And then it's ballet. I mean, it's 19th century ballet art that is being transferred into this revolutionary setting. And then, you know, it's a beautiful piece, and you can watch it on YouTube, and please do, The Red Detachment of Women. It is not Chinese, right? It is, if anything, Western music with some Chinese melodies in it. And so, you know, this whole question of what is Chinese and how would a Chinese ring look like, would it be Chinese, is for me very, very difficult to answer. And I mean, I've fought against my own logic in my book on Dangerous Tunes, the book on Chinese composers from Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the People's Republic of China. It was a book on music and politics. And basically, I thought I can write a book about these 3 different polities and 3 different musics. Well, no, because Chinese composers, unlike French composers nowadays or American composers nowadays, they are very, very keen on writing Chinese music. Okay, it's very important to them to write Chinese music. And in fact, I mean, they know, like Tan Dun knows, because it sells very well to have this ethno type of music. And so this is the part, you know, that gets me. Why can't they just be composers? Why do they have to be Chinese composers? Right? Anyway, we have a question from Nicholas.
South Carolina, and I hope this is going to work. Nicholas. No. Where's the microphone? Oh, I'm sorry. Nicholas? Yes, we couldn't hear you. We couldn't hear you. Why don't you ask a question, and I'll yes. 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 Okay. Okay. So Nicholas
sounds like
Nicholas says like that he thought like saying that he became international was like saying that he arrived in France for the first time.
Yes.
Yes.
Of course.
Yes, he distinguishes between international and global.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So he asked, how do the Chinese negotiate the difference between Chinese and European opera or Wagnerian opera? That is his question. So now I try to make you listen to the answer.
Okay. So how do the Chinese negotiate the difference between Chinese opera and Wagnerian opera or European opera? I think, I mean, as I used this funny term, mixed operatic performance, that actually Thomas Betzwieser also wanted to ask a question about earlier. I think what we have now, for example, in Marco Polo, is very much what the answer to this question should be. That there are negotiations, but they actually go beyond just Chinese opera and just Wagner. They actually use many more musical styles beyond just Chinese opera and just Wagner, and fuse them into each other. And actually, the reason why I said Tan Dun is kind of, Marco Polo is kind of a meta answer to Turandot is because they actually make fun or parody the use of exoticist musical language. And this is the way to fuse, I don't like this word, but anyway, to actually get to a synthesis, maybe it's easier if you actually show that there is thesis and antithesis very clearly, and if you highlight that, and that's what I think is happening in the works by, for example, Chinese composers, but also by many European composers who are like this Finnish or Nordish guy anyway, that I quoted in the end. Is this kind of an answer to your question? Okay. This is the question on cultural imperialism, and this is a very, very important question. Is sort of the West exercising sort of dominant power by saying, you know, you guys have to change? Actually, the West is exercising a lot of power, and that's was something that I was hinting at earlier when I was saying that you can sell yourself very well with ethno, right? And so if you're authentic Chinese and you can put a little bit of that in the music, no matter how unauthentic it is what you put into the music, that's going to sell really, really well. And that's why, for example, Tan Dun calls this piece that used to have no title. It was just called a piece for 4 colors and orchestra. It's now called On Taoism. Actually, that's Tao. The Tao is the way, and the Tao is pronounced Tao in Chinese, and Tan Dun also knows that you pronounce it Tao. But he says Taoism because that's the way that the Tao has been spelled many times, many years, for hundreds of years in the West. And so he sells this piece, right, by using this. And so, yes, there is cultural imperialism, of course. But then, of course, you can go beyond it by using it, by parodying it, by making fun of it, and that's what these guys are also doing. So they're taking us, Westerners, by the nose. We think we've won, but we haven't actually, because they are already one step further than we are. Anyway.
Thank you, Nicholas, for the questions. And I think we also have to kind of get to an end here, because the next lecture is to start very soon, and there will be people pouring in very soon, as we know from the last sessions. So thank you, Nicholas, again, and talk to you very soon. Thank you, Barbara Mittler, very, very much again, and I hope we stay in touch over this. And this is just the start of our project, so maybe there will be more research and more interesting insights on Wagner and China over the next 2 or 3 years, whenever we stop with this. Thank you so much again. Thanks.
Well, I want to thank you, because I wouldn't have done Wagner in China without you. And so I learned a lot, and I really enjoyed it. So
great.
Thank you very much.
This was really fantastic. Thank you. Next week we will be having Susanne Lachenicht from Bayreuth University. She's talking about nationalism and cosmopolitanism. She's doing the keynote on that topic. And I also do want to make one announcement in German now. Die Vollversammlung nächste Woche wird nach der Ringvorlesung in H26 sein. Das war ja bisher noch nicht klar, das steht jetzt fest. Bitte sagen Sie es auch nochmal den Kommilitonen weiter. Das ist eine sehr, sehr, sehr wichtige Veranstaltung, immer für Sie und für uns innerhalb des Semesters. Da können Sie alle möglichen Fragen stellen und wir können auch nochmal ein bisschen unsere Sachen kommunizieren. Bitte erscheinen Sie zahlreich und ich wünsche eine gute Woche. Bis nächste Woche. Tschüss.